Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good evening to my loyal watchers, wherever you may be. As you probably have noticed, I've managed to pack 4 months worth of haircuts into one glorious but rather dodgy event. So that will explain my slightly terrifying appearance, hopefully. And of course, the good news is, at least, hopefully it'll grow again. Anyway, enough of that. Today, I really wanted to continue my talks really about composers, and in particular 20th century composers, and pieces that mean a lot to me personally, and that I'm particularly fond of. So today, it's Janacek's Glagolitic Mass, which was actually one of the first pieces that I had the great honor to perform with the Southampton Philharmonic many years ago now. And I've also conducted it twice since then, once with the Philharmonia, which was a very exciting occasion. But before I go on to talk about the mass in detail, or the piece in detail, I just wanted to relate it a little bit to what I was talking about last week, because it does certainly seem to me that Poulenc and Janacek are quite similar in some ways, which will hopefully become clear, although there are obviously very major differences as well, which I'll also try and explain as we go through. First thing to say about Janacek, I'm sure you too tend to think of him as a 20th century composer, which of course he is. But the interesting thing was that he was born in 1854, which is only 27 years after Beethoven had died. 27 years after Beethoven. So in effect, almost 50 years, the first 50 years almost of Janacek's life was in the 19th century, or that century of Romanticism and Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and Wagner and all the rest of it. And it was only in his latter years, after pretty much the First World War, that he was successful. And that's when he became, or that's when he wrote most of his well-known works, which is why we tend to think of him very much as a 20th century rather than 19th century composer. The other thing that people have a view about with Janacek is we tend to think of him as being a nationalist composer. And of course, nationalism is a bit of a dirty word nowadays, and understandably so, with everything that's going on and all the rest of it. But it's fair to say that if one imagines what life must have been like for a composer like Janacek, you can fully understand why he was so keen to establish his nationhood, which was particularly was Moravia, or the eastern part of Czechoslovakia, because of the huge dominance of German Austria, and obviously to the north, Russia as well. So a bit like Poulenc trying to establish himself as a iconic French composer, not related to Wagner in any way, not even related much to Debussy and the other French composers of the early 20th century. So it is with Janacek. Although he had a great admiration for Dvorak and Smetana, his fellow countrymen, but he wasn't, to be honest, very keen on the Germans and Austrians. To some extent, this was not just for musical reasons, but also because at the time when he was born, that part of Moravia was actually part of the Austrian Empire. So he, as it were, grew up, or certainly was born into the Austrian Empire rather than his natural country of Moravia / Czechoslovakia. So that's probably part of the reason. And the other thing is that he went to study in Leipzig and also in Vienna, and hated both of those. He really did. Not just because of the teachers he had, who he seemed to have very little respect for, but I think the atmosphere and everything else was not conducive to Janacek. He was I think, a troubled person, as many of us are, and he had lots of characteristics which we would see as being very engaging, and other characteristics which were slightly less so. He could be quite rude, quite difficult. He's very, very opinionated, and of course, for many reasons, he also lacked confidence in his own ability, and that, as we know, tends to bring out sides of our personality which perhaps are not the best. But to fill in a bit more detail, he was born to the son of a school teacher, and it was expected that he would become a teacher as well, following the family tradition. But he was always very interested in music, and particularly performing in the early days as a pianist, as an organist, and as a singer. He conducted, he trained choirs, and he was writing music from a very early age, but with comparatively little success, or at least it wasn't awarded with much success at the time. And it was only after he really fell back to the idea of being a teacher, or primarily a music teacher, that I think it gave him both the confidence and the stability to be able to pursue with more energy his compositional ideas. And he founded and became director of what was known then as the Prague Organ School, and eventually became much more associated with the big wigs of Czech society and Czech culture. But it was a very slow process. It took him an awful long time to become established and appreciated. He married one of his students. How often does that happen? And to some extent, it was quite a successful marriage, although it did have a lot of problems later on in his life. In particular, his daughter, who he was very close to, went to Russia to study, got severely ill. Janacek traveled to Russia, to St. Petersburg, I think it was, to visit her. And unfortunately, she died. And that had a very profound effect on him for the rest of his life. And it also affected his marriage in a very major way. He ended up having an affair with a singer, and then he also had a very well-known affair, slightly odd, with a person called Camilla, who is a young married woman, 38 years his junior. By this stage, he was 62 years old. Shocking, I know. It was pretty much unrequited, but he absolutely adored Camilla, and wrote letter after letter after letter to her, and she basically inspired all of his latest works and inspired him to the day he died. So that was slightly unusual, to say the least. But I think the most important thing to think about Janacek was his reluctance to get sucked into the Germanic way of writing, to the Wagners, the Brahms, also the Austrian composers, the Viennese composers, the second Viennese composers. He was very much centered on two things, basically. One is rhythm, very complex, often cross rhythms, very strident, almost staccato patterns. This is partly, I think, a result of the Moravian language and the Slavonic folk songs that he was particularly interested in, which had a very staccato, very short declamatory style. And this rather took over his compositional style, both in opera and in his choral works as well. It's kind of a very recognizable style. So that's one element of his music. And the other element of his music, which is very clear, I think, is the idea of tonal centers. So again, he doesn't do an awful lot of modulation. It is definitely tonal, but it has some really quite harsh dissonances, mostly that they come about because of the complex rhythmic patterns and because of the folk melodies that appear to be very, very strange in some respects. So you have these strident rhythms, very, very strident harmonies at times, but lots of repeating patterns and lots of moving sideways. So rather than just stick to one chord or one key, he'll suddenly move to a different one, just literally move everything, lock, stock and barrel, and then maybe go back or maybe go to a third key center and so on. That's very much part of the style of Janacek. Sir Charles Mackerras, who is one of the late Sir Charles Mackerras, who's one of the great interpreters of Janacek's music, he always said that he thought of Janacek as the very first minimalist because of this idea of patterns, repeating patterns, often moving from one key to another or from one tonal center to another, but essentially the same pattern, lots of repeated notes. What else can I tell you about Janacek? Well, as he became established, and it wasn't really until after 1916 when the theatre in Prague actually agreed to put his great opera Unifer on for the first time. It's been composed many years before, but nobody had a good word to say about it, and it just wasn't considered to be worthy of performance, which is really sad. But from 1916 onwards, he did start to become better established, both in the society in Prague, but also in other parts of the world, including a trip to England, good old England, in 1926. And it was really as a result of that his success started to come to him, but very late in life, by which time he was, of course, in his 70s. So very much a late developer. There's hope for us all yet, I'm happy to say. When he was a student, for instance, Janacek had such a tough time when he was first studying in Prague. He didn't even have a piano in his lodgings, and he had to make do with actually drawing out a keyboard on his table, on his desk, and using that to practice the piano with. He couldn't afford a piano. So to go from that to where he ended up with having the success both in Europe and also in America as well, was quite a major contrast. And that year, 1926, was a very significant one for him. As I said, he came to England. It was a year in which he had the Sinfonietta, the famous Sinfonietta, one of his greatest orchestral works, performed for the first time. And it was also in 1926 that he had the idea of writing the Glagolitic Mass. The text and the idea was suggested to him by a priest using an old Slavonic text. But some commentators have said about this piece, it's not so much a mass, more an orgy, which sounds very crude and a little rude, but actually there is an element of truth in that. Although Janacek was brought up as a Catholic, he had a very, very difficult relationship with organized religion and Catholicism in particular. He wasn't actually very fond of either of those things. So although this does use a kind of version of the Mass as we know it, all five movements, the Kyrie, the Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, and so on, interestingly, he leaves out the Dona Nobis Pacem, the Lord give us peace, or grant us peace, which we're familiar with, which for many composers is the most appealing bit of the entire text. But typically for Janacek, that was not the case. He left that bit of text out altogether. And it has to be said that this piece is not really a mass at all. It's not a liturgical piece. It could never be really performed as part of a liturgy. But it is a kind of cantata, massive scale cantata. And it was more to do with celebrating Czech independence rather than a religious piece. It just happens to use these old words taken from the ordinary of the Mass as we know it. Scored for double chorus, obviously, we know about that, and a vast orchestra, 4 flutes, 3 woodwind of every other description, 4 trumpets, 4 horns, 4 trombones, 3 trombones, tuba, timpani, massive amount of percussion, 2 harps, no less than 2 harps, and of course the very famous organ part, which plays at various points through the piece, but then has this massive and very virtuosic solo, movement near the end. The other thing I think it's worth saying is that this piece is very, very demanding on everybody. The soloists are really stretched to the limit, especially the soprano and the tenor. The high voices, they are given fiendish pieces, bits to sing, phrases to sing, very high, very exposed, often very loud, and having to soar over a massive orchestral texture, which is you need a really big voice to do this piece justice. The instrumental parts also are very tricky. I remember when I did it with the Philharmonia, that it was quite incredible to see them all, especially the violins. After the rehearsal was over, none of them went for their break. They were all sitting there working away at this fiendish violin writing. A lot of it's very high, and although it's quite repetitive, it's very quick and it jumps around. Lots of really quite like strange intervals and lots of tritones and things which are really difficult to finger on a string instrument because you're always having to move around in a slightly awkward way at speed. So it is a very demanding piece. It's also very demanding on the audience as well, but it's certainly worth it. And I do encourage you to listen to it. It's a bit longer than the Poulenc Gloria was, like we talked about last week, but it is an absolutely fabulous piece. And the more you listen, the more exciting you will find it. Just should explain also, there's lots of different versions. Almost every conductor has a different idea of what the original version should be and how many revisions one should incorporate into your performance and how many you should ignore. It's a very, very subjective piece into how people interpret it. And just for an example of that, right at the opening, there's a big fanfare, which I'll play a little bit of in a moment, a big fanfare for 4 bars. And then by bar 5, there's a huge sort of cross rhythm jumble of notes, seven notes and 5 notes, quintuplets and septuplets, all going together, going against each other at the same time. And it causes a real feeling of instability and, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And then it returns to the rather straightforward fanfare immediately after that. But that's quite typical. And some versions actually even those cross rhythms out and put it all into a nice 3/4 instead of having these very, very complex rhythms. I'm just going to play you that. There's no point in playing it on the piano. It just doesn't make any sense. You've got to hear the orchestration and you've got to hear the texture of this music. But just listen to this opening, almost like a standard fanfare, and then this jumble of really complex cross rhythms in bar 5. So I lost that. I'm just going to start that again because we lost the beginning of that. Sorry about that. Then here. Trombones are back in almost before you know it. Jump to a new tonal section. I should say that some versions have a piece called the Intrada, which comes normally at the very end, the last movement of this piece. Apparently at the first performance in 1926, they actually put the last movement at the beginning as well. So it was like a bookends version, which is an exciting idea, but it rather spoils it, I think, because you get one of the best bits of the piece too soon, whereas it works better for me if you have to wait till the end. So don't be confused if you find a different version with a different opening. But that was the opening of the full version of as it were, without revision. This is the beginning of the second movement. Very dramatic. Again, lots of repetition. Sounds a little bit like Britain in some ways. Think of Peter Grimes. There's a little bit of that. But obviously this came first. There's no doubt about that. And here is an example at the beginning of the third movement of the soprano writing. And just listen to the demands made here. Again, really complex rhythms going on. Lots of use of harp, woodwind. Here are these motives. Fairly typical of this piece that one of the first notes the soprano soloist has to sing is consistent high B flats. Nothing unusual about that for Janacek. This is just the beginning of the next movement, just to give you a flavour. Although I should say, the end of the third movement again is one of those different version things. It's actually in most versions organ and timpani. Very dramatic. But apparently Janacek's original idea was just to have the timpani on their own with no chordal accompaniment, which makes it even more dramatic, a bit like Rite of Spring. And as I said, apart from composers like Dvorak and Smetana, Janacek's #1 idols were the Russians, particularly Tchaikovsky and I think Stravinsky as well. The opening of movement 4 then has this very distinctive, typical cello passage. This is the minimalist bit. The chorus come in. And then they dance, of course. And you see the clear influence of the folk music, the Moravian folk music, which is so much an important part of Janacek's writing. This is the longest movement and in some ways the center of it all, the equivalent of the credo. And then we get towards the end of this work, something much gentler, using mostly strings, movement 5, still using the chorus and the tenor and soprano soloist in particular. And then that leads into this, which is movement 6. Which is the equivalent of the Agnus Dei. Most beautiful choral writing. very dramatic. Not afraid to use the large chorus unaccompanied. Wonderful atmospheric music. Then we have the famous organ solo, which is just organ, nothing else, and really quite infamous amongst organists. Again, lots of cross rhythms, lots of repeated patterns. And finally, we have the entrada at the end, which doesn't involve the chorus or the soloist. It's just an orchestral explosion. Moving up. Moving up again. Tonal center. Very high string writing, fiendishly high. Absolutely stunning stuff. One of the most exciting pieces there is, and certainly one of the most exciting pieces I've ever had the good fortune to conduct. I warmly recommend you have a listen. I think the score might be available now online as well. Certainly the full score might be. So do have a look at that if you're interested. And what I was going to say, I think you know, although unfortunately we can't have any real live prom concerts this year, I know the BBC have got really good plans for sharing some of the best bits and broadcasting some of the best bits from previous years. So have a look out for what might be coming up over the next few weeks on the good old Auntie Beeb, because I'm sure there'll be some wonderful things, some of which we may have seen before or heard before, but probably lots of stuff that we've missed. So warm recommendation for that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been of interest. And as I say, I can't recommend this piece enough. If you don't know it or you haven't done it for a while or listened to it for a while, dig it out, have a listen. It is just the most fabulous piece. It really is. Organ wishes to you. Thank you very much again for watching and see you soon. Bye for now.